We're now going to read the Jesuit oath to gain an insight into exactly how they went about trying to destroy the work of the Reformation. When I warned that we'd be going into some twisted and disturbing stuff, this is one of the things I had in mind. It's an extremely disturbing document, but it's important to go over it, as it doesn't just give us insight into the Jesuits. By proxy, it gives us deep insight into the mind of our demonic enemy as a whole, and the tactics that Satan may still employ today against us. Remember, he has no new tricks. Incidentally, I'll post a copy of this in the notes section of the Fuel Project Facebook page if you want to read it again. My son, you have been taught to act the dissembler. Amongst the Roman Catholics to be a Roman Catholic, and to be a spy even among your own brethren, to believe no man, to trust no man. Among the Reformers to be a Reformer, among the Huguenots to be a Huguenot, among the Calvinists to be a Calvinist, among the Protestants generally to be a Protestant, and obtaining their confidence to seek even to speak from their pulpits, and to denounce with all vehemence in your nature our holy religion and the Pope, and even to descend so low as to become a Jew amongst the Jews, that you might be enabled to gather together all information for the benefit of your order as a faithful soldier of the Pope. You have been taught to insidiously plant the seeds of jealousy and hatred between states that were at peace, and incite them to deeds of blood, involving them in war with each other, and to create revolutions and civil wars in communities, provinces and countries that were independent and prosperous, cultivating the arts and the sciences, and enjoying the blessings of peace. To take sides with the combatants, and to act secretly in concert with your brother Jesuit, who might be engaged on the other side, but openly opposed to that which you might be connected, only that the Church might be the gainer in the end, in the conditions fixed in the treaties for peace, and that in the end justifies the means. You have been taught your duties as a spy to gather all statistics, facts and information in your power from every source, to ingratiate yourself into the confidence of the family circle of Protestants and heretics of every class and character, as well as that of the merchant, the banker, the lawyer, amongst the schools and universities, in parliament and legislatures, and in the judiciaries and councils of state, and to be all things to all men for the Pope's sake, whose servants we are unto death. You have received all your instructions heretofore as a novice, a neophyte, and have served as a coadjutor, confessor, and priest, but you have not yet been invested with all that is necessary to command in the army of Loyola in the service of the Pope. You must serve the proper time as the instrument and executioner as directed by your superiors, for none can command here who has not consecrated his labours with the blood of the heretic, for without the shedding of blood no man can be saved. Therefore, to fit yourself for your work and make your own salvation sure, you will, in addition to your former oath of obedience to your order and allegiance to the Pope, repeat after me. I promise that, and declare that I will, when opportunity presents, make and wage relentless war, secretly or openly, against all Protestants and Liberals as I am directed to do, to extirpate and exterminate them from the face of the whole earth, and that I will spare neither age, sex, or condition, and that I will hang, burn, waste, boil, flay, strangle, and bury alive these infamous heretics, rip up the stomachs and wombs of their women, and crush their infants' heads against the walls, in order to annihilate for ever their execrable race. That when the same cannot be done openly, I will secretly use the poisoned cup, the strangulating cord, the steel of the poniard, or the leaden bullet, regardless of the honour, rank, dignity, or authority of the person or persons, whatever may be their condition in life, either public or private, as I at any time may be directed to do so by any agent of the Pope, or superior of the Brotherhood of the Holy Faith, the Society of Jesus. By reading these words we gain a full appreciation of their shocking tactics, which can be summed up like this. Their intention was to become part of the faith, system, culture, or group that they intended to destroy. Then from within they would sow seeds of hate and division. Their method was to present themselves as one thing on the surface, but to be secretly working away with each other for a very different purpose behind the scenes. They would sometimes pretend to be enemies on opposing sides in public, but behind the scenes they were actually cohorts, working together towards the same goal. This type of attack is sometimes referred to as becoming a fifth column, meaning that the most effective way to attack something is not from the north, or the south, or the east, or the west, but from within. Cicero once said, A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and he carries his banners openly. But the traitor moves among those within the gates freely, his sly whispers rustling through all the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. For the traitor appears not traitor, he speaks in the accents familiar to his victims, and he wears their face and their garments, and he appeals to the baseness that lies deep in the hearts of all men. He rots the soul of a nation, he works secretly and unknown in the night, to undermine the pillars of a city. He infects the body politic, so that it can no longer resist. A murderer is less to be feared. The fifth column tactic is of course a trademark of Satan. It was the very tactic he used to persuade a third of the angels to fall with him and to become his army of demons. He went around whispering in the ears of anyone who would listen to turn them against God. More recently, ex-witches have spoken of being assigned to local churches by their coven with the aim of being involved in the congregation on the surface, but all the while secretly working against it from within, frustrating its aims and unity. If something is attacked from without, it will put up its defenses and fight back. But if, by using deceit, the attacker can become part of the thing it wishes to destroy and gains the trust of those involved, they can take it down from within. But could we really expect any human being to carry out the acts described in this monstrous Jesuit oath? Well, remember that the spiritual exercises were designed to eliminate all human emotion and to turn the men into machines. And just as demonic influence was so clearly at work in Loyola's cave experience, so they are involved in the spiritual exercises. H. Boehmer in Les Jesuits writes, "We imbue unto him spiritual forces which he would find very difficult to eliminate later. These forces can come up again to the surface, sometimes after years of not even mentioning them, and become so imperative that the will finds itself unable to oppose any obstacle, and has to follow their irresistible impulse." In other words, through the spiritual exercises, the Jesuit initiate becomes possessed and finds themselves compelled to act according to the will of these demonic forces within.
As one examines the history of the Roman Catholic Church, the frequency of abominable practices and events seen leaves little doubt that she is not the fulfillment of God's salvation program on the earth. The level of wickedness produced by this false system negates such an idea. Once the evidence is assessed, it becomes obvious that she belongs to the kingdom of darkness. The following are some of the most evil atrocities committed by the Roman religion in history. Pope Urban VI reigned from AD 1378 to 1389. During his reign, an anti-pope rose up, stating he was the real pope, that is Clement VII. Because Joanna, Queen of Nepal, sided with Clement VII, Pope Urban VI had her deposed and replaced by her cousin, Charles of Durazzo. However, Charles of Durazzo and Pope Urban VI later had a falling out, resulting in Charles as well as some cardinals plotting against him. As a result, Pope Urban VI had 6 of these cardinals brutally tortured and then murdered. In fact, it is stated that while these cardinals were being tortured, Pope Urban VI complained that their screams were not loud enough for his satisfaction. Benedict IX reigned as pope twice in the 11th century. During his second reign, he actually sold his papal office to his godfather, Giovanni Gratiano, archpriest of the Venerable Church of St. John, who then became Pope Gregory VI. The papacy was sold to him for 1,500 pounds of gold. Alexander VI reigned as pope from AD 1492 to 1503. Historians note that he amassed ridiculous amounts of wealth. He fathered 7 children with different women, 2 of which were after he became pope. Historian Williston Walker notes that he was, quote, "a man of unbridled immorality. His great concern was to advance his bastard children, especially his daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, by advantageous marriages, and his unscrupulous and murderous son, Cesare Borgia, by aiding him to carve a principality out of the Papal States." Philip Schaff explains an unthinkable event near the end of Alexander VI's life, quote, 2 years before Alexander VI's death, October 31st, 1501, an orgy took place in the Vatican by Caesar's appointment, whose obscenity the worst of the imperial revels could hardly have surpassed. 50 courtesans spent the night dancing with the servants and others present, first with their clothes on and then nude, the Pope and Lucretia looking on. The women, still naked and going on their hands and feet, picked up chestnuts thrown on the ground and then received prizes of cloaks, caps, and other articles. E.R. Chamberlain likewise confirms, quote, "The Vatican has been the scene of scandalous enough behavior. Now the court became actively criminal, curiously, deliberately perverted." 50 Roman harlots coupled with 50 palace servants for prizes presented by Alexander, unquote. It's interesting to note that this is the Pope who canonized, that is, made saint, one of Rome's favorite saints, Anselm of Canterbury. The next atrocity concerns forgeries Rome created in order to deceive people to believe in papal primacy and Roman supremacy. The first is called the Donation of Constantine. This document was forged in the 8th to 9th century by Rome. In it, the Emperor Constantine, who reigned during the papal reign of Pope Sylvester I, AD 314 to 345, is represented as conferring on Pope Sylvester I and Rome certain prerogatives and honors, which 8th to 5th century Roman Catholicism would point to as evidence for the historicity of her papal doctrine and policy. In it, Emperor Constantine gives to Pope Sylvester I primacy over the church patriarchs of the world and dominion over Rome and the Western states. The document was proven to be false in the 15th century. It was not a letter from Emperor Constantine, it was created by Rome. Another similar example is known as the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals, which were produced in the 9th century by Catholic scholars. They were a set of documents forged in the name of the late Isidore of Seville, the 6th and 7th century Archbishop of Seville. These documents, according to Schaff, quote, "gave legal expression to the popular opinion of the papacy, raised and strengthened its power more than any other agency." In fact, on the same page, Schaff explains that the papal teaching within these forged decretals, quote, "forms to a large extent the basis of the canon law of the Church of Rome," unquote. In other words, Rome's canon law, which is still used today, is based on these papal forgeries. John XII reigned as Pope from AD 955 to 964. He was one of the most immoral popes of history and engaged in things one would expect a Satanist to engage in. Historian Philip Schaff notes, John XII disgraced the tiara for 8 years. He was one of the most immoral and wicked popes, ranking with Benedict IX, John the 23rd, and Alexander VI. He was charged by a Roman synod, no one contradicting, with almost every crime of which depraved human nature is capable, and deposed as a monster of iniquity. Schaff lists the following charges of the synod against John XII. Appearing constantly with an armed sword, lance, helmet, and breastplate, that he neglected matins and vespers, that he had made a boy of 10 years a bishop, and ordained a bishop or deacon in a stable, that he had mutilated a priest, that he had set houses on fire like Nero, that he had committed homicide and adultery, had violated virgins and widows high and low, lived with his father's mistress, converted the pontifical palace into a brothel, drank to the health of the devil, and invoked at the gambling table the help of Jupiter and Venus and other heathen demons. Now, the reformers protested the veneration of relics which Catholics fervently sought out in the medieval era. It was affirmed that veneration of these fake relics would shorten a person's time in purgatory. Explaining some of these is Eleanor Herman, quote, "The body parts of the saints were called first-class relics. Some Italian churches boasted magnificent first-class items, drops of Virgin Mary's breast milk, the foreskin of Jesus' penis, and his umbilical cord. Other churches offered second-class relics, articles that had been intimately connected with the holy person during his or her life. One Roman church exposed Jesus' cradle from the manger, and another the marble pedestal on which Pontius Pilate had had him flogged. This outraged regenerated Bible believers such as Luther and Calvin. In his work, The Theology of John Calvin, Charles Party highlights some of Calvin's recollections of these absurd relics, quote, "In a rare reference to his childhood, Calvin expresses the outrage of a small boy, observing the poor ignorant women of his parish, unable to distinguish between the figures of saints, murderers, and demons, adoring all alike with garlands. As an adult, Calvin notes that among the amazing things an account of relics would reveal is that every apostle had more than 4 bodies, and every saint 2 or 3. Equally amazing, anatomically, is the display of the foreskin of Jesus at 3 churches, one in Chirac, one in Rome, and a third in Hildesheim. Again, although only one man carried the cross, if all the pieces were assembled in the same place, one could build a ship. Among the credulous, goat droppings are taken for the beads of the Virgin Mary." Calvin recognizes that since the body of the Virgin Mary is not on earth, no bones can be produced, but the compensation is her breast milk. Had the breasts of the Most Holy Virgin yielded a more copious supply than is given by a cow, or had she continued to nurse during her whole lifetime, she scarcely could have furnished the quantity which is exhibited, unquote. The pornocracy is a name given to a period of 68 years in the 10th century, which spanned the reign of 15 popes. It started with Sergius III, who reigned from AD 904 to 911, and lasted to John XIII's reign from 965 to 972. It was a period where a family of nobility called the Theophylact family, most notably the women of the family Theodora and her daughter Marozia, had firm control over the popes and led the papacy into much immorality, wickedness, and corruption. J.N.D. Kelly and M.J. Walsh note, the papacy itself was effectively controlled by this powerful, unscrupulous family. Pope Sergius III was intimate with and had a child with Theodora's 15-year-old daughter, Marozia. Their child would then be installed as pope by the Theophylact family when he grew up. He would be named Pope John XI. The way Pope Sergius III became pope was that he marched to Rome with an armed force, deposed anti-pope Christopher, and had him thrown into the Gaul, after which he was executed. Pope John X, AD 914 to 928, was at first on good terms with the Theophylact family, which was at this time still controlling the papacy. However, because of certain political actions, Marozia, daughter of Theophylact, organized a revolt against him. They had his brother murdered, and he himself ended up being deposed of his papal office and suffocated to death. This family freely installed popes such as Leo VI, Stephen VII, and others. Marozia married numerous times during the siege of the papacy. Commenting on this horrible time, Philip Schaff notes, the papacy itself lost all independence and dignity, and became the prey of avarice, violence, and intrigue, a veritable synagogue of Satan. It was dragged through the quagmire of the darkest crimes, and would have perished in utter disgrace had not Providence saved it for better times. Pope followed pope in rapid succession, and most of them ended their career in deposition, prison, and murder. These Roman Amazons, Theodora and Marozia, combined with the fatal charms of personal beauty and wealth, a rare capacity for intrigue, and a burning lust for power and pleasure, they turned the Church of St. Peter into a den of robbers, and the residence of his successors into harem, and they gloried in their shame. Hence this infamous period is called the Papal Pornocracy, or Heterocracy. Pope Stephen VI reigned as pope from AD 896 to 897. He was consecrated as Bishop of Anagni by previous Pope Formosus, who reigned from AD 891 to 896. However, Stephen VI turned his back on Formosus. After Formosus died, Stephen VI had his 8-month-old corpse exhumed, dressed in full papal vestments, and put on a throne for a mock trial on charges of perjury, coveting the papacy and violating the canons prohibiting the translation of bishops. A deacon stood beside Formosus's dead body and answered for him at the mock trial. Formosus was declared to be guilty, his fingers cut off, and his body tossed into the Tiber River. This is truly satanic. Stephen VI's actions did not go unpunished. A few months later, the outraged Catholic supporters of Formosus, as Kelly and Walsh note, quote, deposed Stephen, stripped him of his papal insignia, and threw him into the Gaul, where he was shortly afterwards strangled, unquote. Next is the historical abomination of indulgences. An indulgence is the remission of temporal punishments of sin here and in purgatory. It was proclaimed by medieval Rome that these indulgences could shorten people's time in the non-existent place called purgatory. Pope Urban II, who reigned from AD 1088 to 1099, offered indulgences to the Crusaders who died battling Muslims, whereby all their temporal punishments for sin were said to be remitted. Not only is the idea of indulgences an abomination, but the fact that Roman Catholicism sold indulgences in the Middle Ages is unthinkably satanic. On April 18, 1506, Pope Julius II put out a bull promising indulgence to those who paid money to him. He would use these funds to construct St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Rome commissioned certain preachers like Tetzel to go around scaring Catholics into giving their money so that they could get loved ones out of purgatory faster. The logical abuse which came about is that people would sin willfully, thinking it was okay since they would just pay money to get the temporal punishments for sin remitted. This despicable practice was fervently opposed by the reformer Martin Luther. The Inquisitions. The word Inquisition refers to harsh or unfair investigations or a series of questions. The Roman Catholic Inquisitions consisted of organizations within the Catholic Church acting on behalf of the Catholic Church, finding, interrogating, and punishing people who disagreed with Roman Catholic theology. We will be discussing two of the main stages or periods of Roman Catholic Inquisition. The first to cover is known as the Medieval Inquisition, which was officially launched in the 13th century. and it involved the persecution of groups known as the Cathars, Waldensians, and others as well. The second stage or period is known as the Spanish Inquisition, and it began in the beginning of the 15th century. It was launched against Protestants, Jews, Muslims, and others. Medieval Inquisition. The lead-up to the 13th century Inquisition involves the massacre of a group of dissident believers known as the Cathars or Albigenses, who rose up in France in the 11th century. Although there is room for debate as to if the Cathars held to truly heretical teachings, it is a fact that they believed the Roman Catholic Church's sacramental system was evil, and that the Catholic Church was not teaching God's message, which was expressed in the Holy Bible. These people had a very high view of Scripture. They believed that when secular authorities punished heretics, that this was sin. The name Cathar means pure. They sought to live lives of holiness. A 13th century Dominican named Brenarius estimated that by his day there were over 4 million Cathars in over 1,000 cities. Rome perceived this movement as a serious threat which was to be eliminated. In 1179, the Third Lateran Council condemned and anathematized this group, and in 1208 Pope Innocent III decided to launch a vicious crusade against them. This crusade lasted from 1209 to 1229. In a general letter to the faithful, Pope Innocent III angrily wrote, quote, "O most mighty soldiers of Christ, most brave warriors, ye oppose the agents of Antichrist, and ye fight against the servants of the old serpent. Fight for God." This war on the Cathars, though ultimately unsuccessful in and of itself in getting rid of all of them, was nevertheless extremely bloody and ruthless. In one incident, the so-called Battle of Bezij resulted in the slaughter of 10,000 to 20,000 believers. Commenting on this incident, Philip Schaff notes, "Neither age nor sex was spared. Church walls interposed no protection, and 7,000 were put to death in St. Magdalen's Church alone." Pope Innocent III offered his crusade soldiers spiritual reward for the murder of these believers, that is, indulgences for the remission of temporal punishments for sin. This crusade involved many massacres as well as the burning of Cathars who were captured. The clerics within the Cathar movement were ruthlessly eliminated without the benefit of a hearing. In regards to the stronghold of Minerve, 140 Cathar clerics were burnt alive, and the prisoners had their ears, noses, and lips cut off. Commenting on the severity of this crusade, historian Williston Walker notes that Innocent III's efforts, quote, led to 20 years of destructive warfare, in which the power of the southern nobility was shattered, and cities and provinces devastated. Another group which was to be eliminated was known as the Waldensians. This movement began in 1177 in Italy and was based on the teachings of Peter Waldo, AD 1140 to 1218. The Waldensian believers affirmed that the Bible was the ultimate authority, and that whatever was not found in Holy Scripture was not to be believed by Christians. These believers practiced memorizing the Bible, and its preachers went out 2 by 2 preaching. They, among other things, rejected masses and prayers for the dead as unscriptural, and denied Rome's doctrine of purgatory. They also refused to venerate saints. Because of these teachings, the Roman Catholic Church enacted what is known as the Episcopal Inquisition, whereby local Catholic bishops would turn unrepentant Bible believers like the Waldensians and others, who refused Rome's teachings, over to civil authorities for punishment. This Episcopal Inquisition was ordered by Pope Lucius III, who reigned from AD 1181 to 1185. On November 4th, 1184, he, in unison with the Council of Verona, issued the bull Ad Abolendum, that is, on abolition, where he condemned and excommunicated the Waldensians and other sects. The bull says, quote, "To abolish the malignity of diverse heresies which are lately sprung up in most parts of the world, it is but fitting that the power committed to the Church should be awakened, that by the concurring assistance of the imperial strength, both the insolence and malpertness of the heretics in their false designs may be crushed. We likewise declare all entertainers and defenders of the said heretics be liable to the same sentence, unless by adjuring his heresy and making satisfaction, he immediately returns to the orthodox faith. We decree him to be left to the sentence of the secular judge, to receive condign, that is deserved punishment, according to the quality of the offense." In the same bull, Pope Lucius III also decreed that the goods and money of the punished heretics be confiscated for the use of the Roman Church. This led to what is known as the first formal Inquisition in the medieval era. In 1229, the Council of Toulouse issued a decree sanctioning burning at the stake for the punishment of heresy. Likewise, the German Mirror of Saxon laws were compiled in 1235 and ordered the execution of heretics and unbelievers by burning at the stake. With Cathars still around due to the failure of Innocent III's crusade against them, as well as Waldensians and other dissidents walking the lands, Pope Gregory IX, who reigned from AD 1227 to 1247, cemented the Inquisition. He took interrogation, trial, and the punishment of heretics out of the hands of the bishops and placed them into the hands of the monastic orders such as the Franciscans and Dominicans. Everything was now in order for possibly the worst atrocity in all of history to be carried out. By 1244, the Cathars were basically wiped out. Their last refuge was Montségur, France. However, they were overcome by the Inquisition, and the 200 remaining Catholic clerics were there burnt alive. As historian Williston Walker remarks, by means of Inquisition, the Cathars were utterly rooted out by the middle of the 14th century. As time progressed, the Inquisition became crueler and crueler. The final step in configuring the procedure of the Inquisition was made by Pope Innocent IV, when he, in the bull Ad Extirpanda of 1252, authorized the use of brutal torture as a means of extracting a confession from alleged heretics and Bible believers. This practice was also confirmed by later popes such as Alexander IV in 1259 and Pope Clement IV in 1265. Again, during this period, the inquisitors responsible for hearings, confiscation of property, overseeing torture, and burning at the stake were mainly priests within the monastic Dominican and Franciscan orders. In regards to citizens turning in other citizens for interrogation, the Council of Toulouse, in its 18th canon, made it clear that mere suspicion or public rumor of heresy was sufficient for formal Inquisition proceedings to be leveled. This resulted in people falsely being accused of heresy by Catholic citizens they had rivalries with. Others turned in members of their own community in order to appear loyal to Rome and avoid Inquisition themselves. There were even fixed rewards given to spies who specialized in ratting out suspected heretics and Bible believers. In regards to the mode and procedure of Inquisition here, a suspected heretic would first be accused, then if he denied being a heretic or a Bible believer, a trial was held. He was first threatened with death, usually with the choice of 1, confessing and being forgiven by Rome, or 2, being burnt at the stake. If the person rejected those 2 choices, then they were imprisoned with little to no food. If the person still didn't confess and recant or choose death, then he would be visited and pressed by others who had previously been tried by the inquisitors in order to make a decision. Then if that didn't work, the person was brutally tortured in various ways in order to extract confession. This usually resulted in a confession and recantation, but nevertheless others such as Bible believers would bravely endure the torture and not give up their faith in the Word of God and in Christ. Schaff notes that Rome was not just satisfied with torture and burning alive of Bible believers, heretics, and unbelievers, but, quote, the Inquisition made war upon the dead and exhumed the bodies of those found to have died in heresy and burned them. Although figures can be multiplied many times, Schaff notes that during the administration of an inquisitor from Toulouse named Bernard Guy, who tortured and murdered from AD 1306 to 1323, 42 persons were tortured and burnt to death, 69 bodies were exhumed and burnt, and 300 were imprisoned. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX appointed a French Dominican named Robert of Petit to be Inquisitor General. He had hundreds of victims. In a period of just 3 months, he had 50 people, both male and female, burnt to death. He burnt 20 to death in Cambrai and 10 in Douai. In 1239, at Mount Amy, he had 27 burnt to death, or as another account reports, 180. Michael C. Thomset mentions one of the most sadistic and maniacal inquisitors of the 13th century, namely Conrad of Marburg. He investigated heresy in Languedoc and Rhineland. Many placed into his hands were given the choice of speedy confession or death by burning. The Archbishop of Mayence wrote to Pope Gregory IX about this cruel method, and the Pope's response was to identify Conrad as a champion of the Christian faith and to encourage him to continue punishing heretics as well as alleged witches. Conrad was known for stripping naked those he tortured in order to first humiliate them. Now, the previously mentioned Waldensian Bible believers, though hunted vigorously and massacred by Rome during the Inquisition, nevertheless miraculously survived it, unlike the Cathars. Schaff notes that in 1308, Dominican and Franciscan inquisitors hunted and murdered the Waldensians in Bohemia and Poland. However, after facing the Inquisition and enduring the horrors it produced, the Waldensians eventually escaped into the mountain regions of northern Italy in order to avoid total annihilation. They survived over the centuries, and many of them eventually joined the Protestant Reformation movement in the 16th century. It's interesting to note that many of Rome's quote-unquote saints came out of these Dominican and Franciscan orders, which were involved with the Inquisition. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Albert the Great were Dominicans, and St. Bonaventure was a Franciscan. It's sickening how Rome would canonize and exalt men who were involved in orders which oversaw the torture and death of massive amounts of Bible believers and others. The medieval Inquisition did not stop there. In AD 1484, Pope Innocent VIII produced the bull Summis Desiderantis Affectibus, wherein he authorized inquisitors to find, try, and murder alleged witches. In this so-called Great Witch Hunt, intellectual arguments meant to persuade the person of their error were not utilized by inquisitors. Instead, the goal was to extract a confession by torture and then murder those rumored to be alleged witches. It was believed by the Catholics that a witch could not cry from pain, and since those tortured cried, the papal inquisitors claimed the devils must have made them cry as a trick to convince everyone they were not a witch. The inquisitors would often shave the bodies of alleged witches, including the private parts, since Catholic superstition at that time said that witches would 1. Hide objects of witchcraft in their hair or private parts, and 2. That witches had a birthmark or scar which would function as a teat to feed milk or blood to imps or the devil himself. Inquisitors would therefore stab alleged witches on their scars or birthmarks with needles, since they claimed a witch would not bleed if their witch's teat was pierced. However, when the people did bleed, the torturers claimed Satan allowed the bleeding to make it appear the person was not a witch. They then resorted to torture such as putting hot boiling fat in the person's eyes, underarms, and thighs, which many times led to infection or death. In Germany, alleged witches who were tortured into confession then had hot irons put on their breasts and arms, their right hand cut off, their body burnt at the stake, and their ashes thrown into the river. Most of these accused witches were simply social outcasts the community did not like, or women who were poor, unmarried, elderly, pale, or wrinkly. Tens of thousands of alleged witches were murdered in the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition. Just when one thinks it could not possibly get any worse, they encounter the second phase of Inquisition known as the Spanish Inquisition. The Council of Tortosa in 1429 showed that certain Jews were conversos, that is, those who outwardly confessed Catholicism, but were not getting their children baptized and were still practicing Jewish feasts and attending the synagogue. The Council of Basel also confirmed this was taking place. In 1478, Queen Isabella of modern-day Spain and her husband Ferdinand appealed to Pope Sixtus IV, who reigned from AD 1471 to 1484, to establish Inquisition. Pope Sixtus IV agreed and issued the bull Exigit Sinceras Devotionis Affectus, which promulgated the investigation as to whether or not converted Jews and others were secretly continuing to practice their original religion. Historian Williston Walker remarks, "The Spanish Inquisition especially concerned itself with rooting out those Jewish and Muslim converts who had supposedly lapsed from the faith and with maintaining purity of blood in all offices of state and church. It was also to deal harshly with Spanish Protestants and all those suspected of Lutheranism." The way this Inquisition was set up was that 3 Catholic priests would be appointed to a tribunal being selected by Queen Isabella and Ferdinand. In 1480, 2 Catholic Dominicans were given this role, namely Juan de San Martin and Miguel de Murillo. Their advisor was Juan de Medina. As the plan progressed, there were too many prisoners in the common-containing area, and so they had to be moved to gloomy dungeons for Inquisition. On February 6, 1481, 6 months after this tribunal was established, 6 conversos accused of heresy were publicly burnt to death after a Catholic named Friar Alfonso de Ojeda first gave a grisly sermon to the masses. The papacy then appointed 7 more inquisitors. In 1482, more Inquisition tribunals were set up in Cordoba, and in 1483, even more were set up in Jaén and Ciudad Real. Schaff notes, quote, "According to a contemporary, by November 4, 1491, 298 persons had been committed to the flames." In regards to the tribunal in Ciudad Real, Schaff relays that within 2 years it had 52 heretics burnt, and in Avila, from 1490 to 1500, 75 were burnt alive and 26 dead bodies were exhumed and burned. In the 1480s, many conversos fled to Portugal to escape Inquisition. However, in 1536, the Inquisition found its way even there. In his work, The Grand Inquisitor's Manual, Jonathan Kirsch relays that, quote, "Protestants joined the Jewish and Muslim conversos as principal targets of the Spanish Inquisition. In 1533, a priest who was charged with the seduction of a nun sought to appease the inquisitors by offering them the names of 70 men and women whom he denounced as Lutheran heretics. The first Protestant burned for heresy by the Spanish Inquisition went to the stake in 1540, and 26 of the 30 accused heretics at the Auto at Toledo in 1559 were Protestants. The procedures of Inquisition at this time were as follows, as developed by the Inquisitors General Thomas D. Torquemada. First, there was accusation. Any civilian could level an accusation of heresy or immorality against another, and it would result in a tribunal. Even if no citizen accused anyone, inquisitors could freely accuse citizens. Abuses crept in since the wealthy were often targeted by inquisitors since their wealth would be confiscated and go towards funding Inquisition. Second, there was detention. Once accused, the person was detained and their property was seized temporarily, depending on the outcome of the tribunal. Detention often lasted months. Families of the detained were not informed, which often resulted in women and children of the family not being able to survive without the man of the house around. Thirdly, after detention came interrogation. The goal was to gain a confession and pass a sentence. There was no intention of convincing the accused of the error of their alleged heresy or immorality. There were many methods of torture used to gain a confession, including the following. There was the garrucha or strappado, which was a suspension system which had ropes, weights, and pulleys. The victim's arms were tied behind their back. They were hoisted in the air, and then they were dropped. They were stopped in midair right before hitting the ground, so that the weights tied to their ankles caused great pain and dislocation. There was also the taka, which was basically waterboarding, where a cloth was put over the victim's mouth and water poured in, resulting in the victim feeling like they were drowning. Also utilized was the potro, or rack. The victim was placed on this device, and their arms and legs were severely stretched, causing excruciating tearing of the muscles and dislocation. In 1591, Pablo Garcia, the secretary of the Suprema in Madrid, wrote instructions on how this torture was to be carried out. He stated, quote, "If the prisoner should die or be injured or suffer heavy bleeding or have a limb mutilated during the torture, this will be their fault and responsibility and not ours, because they have refused to tell the truth." Fourthly, after interrogation through torture came hearings and trial. Fifthly, you had sentencing. Acquittals were very rare in Spanish Inquisition. When found guilty, the victim was handed over to the secular authorities for burning at the stake. Burnings were usually like festivities where Catholics in the community would watch and be entertained. The ritual began with a mass and then a public procession of the victim. Instances of burning heretics during the Spanish Inquisition lasted into the late 18th century. In his 2007 work, Inquisition, The Reign of Fear, Toby Green remarks on the statistics of the Spanish Inquisition, quote, "The Inquisition was at its most severe in Spain during the first 50 years after its formation in 1478, when it is estimated that 50,000 people were tried, a significant proportion as religiados burnt at the stake. In some years, such as 1492, 2,000 people may have been relaxed in person, and another 2,000 burnt in effigy. Approximately 700 people were put to death in Seville alone between 1481 and 1488, and another 50 in Ciudad Real between 1483 and 1484. In the Crown of Aragon, meanwhile, roughly 1,000 people were relaxed between 1485 and 1530. Between 1540 and 1700, 84,000 people were tried. In the reign of Philip V, there was a rekindling of violence after the War of the Spanish Succession finished in 1714, with 1,463 trials, with 111 executions. In Portugal, there were approximately 45,000 trials between 1536 and 1767, including 13,667 in Goa, with at least 1,543 people being relaxed.
Pope Francis is now saying that you don't have to be a believer, you don't have to believe in God in order to get to heaven. And in the article here, and it's posted up in Drudge in the event of when one of this is authenticated, and they are saying allegedly that he's reaching out to atheists and agnostics. And the Pope has struck, I'm reading now from the article, it says the Pope has struck a surprisingly conciliatory tone towards atheists and agnostics, saying that God will forgive them as long as they behave morally and live according to their conscience. What a blasphemous statement. That is blasphemy, Pope Francis. That is blasphemous, sir. I know, the Catholics get all in a tizzy about this, but that's blasphemy. You cannot live morally and according to your conscience, where every man does what's right in his own sight, Pope Francis. What? That is blasphemy, sir.
Originally, the word Protestant was a reference to those who protested the claims made by the Roman Church. Even in the 19th century, Charles Spurgeon said, "For truth's sake, our Protestantism must protest perpetually, no peace with Rome." But in times past, such teachings from the Albigenses, the Waldenses, and to a great extent those of Wycliffe and the Lollards were suppressed and nearly stamped out by the Crusades and Inquisitions. Yet with movable type and the printing of books and Bibles faster than the popes could burn them, the teachings of the Reformers spread like a fire across Europe. But some claim that it was not simply the teaching of salvation by grace that brought the reform, but the recognition of the papal system as the fulfillment of God's greatest warnings to the Church, as set forth in the prophecies of the Bible. Was it this teaching that created such determination in men like Tyndale, Luther, and others? Protestant minister Dr. Ian Paisley writes, "It has been claimed that when Luther recognized the papacy as Antichrist, it was only then that the Reformation gained momentum." Yet Luther himself acknowledged that what he was teaching did not begin with him, but had been handed down from centuries earlier. He wrote, "We are not the first to declare the papacy to be the kingdom of Antichrist, since for many years before us, so many and such great men, whose number is large and whose memory is eternal, have undertaken to express the same thing so clearly and plainly." Jesus said, "And call no man your father upon the earth, for one is your Father which is in heaven." Yet the popes took to themselves the name Holy Father, along with all claims of authority that might be assumed by such a title. Pope Innocent III, who fathered the Inquisition, said, "The Pope holdeth place on earth, not simply of a man, but of the true God." Meanwhile, Pope Nicholas said of himself, "I am in all and above all, so that God himself and I, the Vicar of God, hath both one consistory, and I am able to do almost all that God can do. I then, being above all, seem by this reason to be above all gods." Nicholas even claimed that the popes had the power to change the gospel itself, saying, "Wherefore, no marvel, if it be in my power to dispense with all things, yea, with the precepts of Christ." But in the Bible, Jesus says, "Behold, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it, and no man openeth." The Apostle Paul warned that, "If any man or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you, let him be accursed." Yet despite these biblical warnings, the popes repeatedly claimed they were equal to and above God, and were even called by Catholics our Lord God, the Pope. The Lateran Council, while addressing Pope Julius II, said to him, "Take care that we lose not that salvation, that life and breath which thou hast given us, for thou art shepherd, thou art physician, thou art governor, thou art husbandman, thou finally art another God on earth." In the 19th century, Cardinal Giuseppe Sarto, who would later become Pope Pius X, declared, "The Pope is not simply the representative of Jesus Christ. On the contrary, he is Jesus Christ himself, under the veil of the flesh. Does the Pope speak? It is Jesus Christ who is speaking. Hence, when anyone speaks of the Pope, it is not necessary to examine, but to obey. Jesus said of himself, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Yet Pope Pius IX blasphemously declared, I alone am the successor of the apostles, the vicar of Jesus Christ. I am the way, the truth, and the life. The popes have not only made claims to be God, but have insisted that salvation itself depends directly upon obedience to them. Pope Boniface VIII said, we declare, say, define, and pronounce that it is absolutely necessary for the salvation of every human creature to be subject to the Roman Pontiff. Pope Clement VI said, no man outside obedience to the Pope of Rome can ultimately be saved. All who have raised themselves against the faith of the Roman Church and died in final impenitence have been damned and gone down to hell. Even in modern times, Pope John XXIII in 1958 declared, into this fold of Jesus Christ no man may enter unless he be led by the sovereign pontiff, and only if they be united to him can men be saved. In 1984, Pope John Paul II was quoted as saying, don't go to God for forgiveness of sins, come to me. The quote was based on a Los Angeles Times article which reported, rebutting a belief widely shared by Protestants and a growing number of Roman Catholics, Pope John Paul II dismissed the widespread idea that one can obtain forgiveness directly from God. Furthermore, according to traditional Catholicism, obedience to the papacy is said to be required, no matter how dreadful the Pope might be. Catherine of Siena, one of the patron saints of Italy, whose mummified head is still preserved in Rome today, said, even if the Pope were Satan incarnate, we ought not to raise up our heads against him, but calmly lie down to rest in his bosom. He who rebels against our Father is condemned to death. For that which we do to him, we do to Christ. We honor Christ if we honor the Pope. Such demands for blind obedience were confirmed by the popes themselves, but confronted by the reformers. By men like Martin Luther, who said, the Pope, possessed by demons, defends his tyranny with the canon Si Papa, or Yes Father. This canon states clearly, if the Pope should lead the whole world into the control of hell, he is nevertheless not to be contradicted. It's a terrible thing that on account of the authority of this man, we must lose our souls, which Christ redeemed with his precious blood. Because of this evidence, Luther declared, I believe the Pope is the masked and incarnate devil, because he is the Antichrist. It is important to understand that this belief was not just confined to Luther, but was held by all the reformers from John Wycliffe in the 14th century to Charles Spurgeon in the late 19th century. Spurgeon said, it is the bounden duty of every Christian to pray against Antichrist. And as to what Antichrist is, no sane man ought to raise a question. If it be not the popery in the Church of Rome, there is nothing in the world that can be called by that name. The Westminster Confession of Faith, along with the Savoy Confession, the Old Baptist Confession, and the Methodist views of John Wesley, all included the declaration that the Pope is that Antichrist, that man of sin, and son of perdition, that exalteth himself in the church. This was also the belief of the men who translated the King James Bible. In their opening dedication, they commended the king for writing in defense of the truth, which hath given such a blow unto that man of sin as will not be healed. The view of the Antichrist, not as a single man, but of many men in a single office, was based in part on the teaching of John Wycliffe. In the Gospel of Matthew, the disciples asked Jesus, "What shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" Jesus said to them, "Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." Wycliffe believed that the many who say, "I am Christ," are in fact the popes. The Pope's title, Vicarius Christi, literally means another Christ. Wycliffe concluded that Antichrist is thus a monstrous composite. In further explaining the Pope's title, author Dave Hunt writes, "The Latin equivalent of the Greek anti is vicarius, from which comes vicar. Thus, Vicar of Christ literally means Antichrist." But the view of the papacy as Antichrist is not widely held by Protestants today. Still, there are those who continue to uphold the Reformers' original beliefs. Perhaps it has something to do with this official Vatican portrait of the current Pope. It is called "The Truth, the Way, and the Life," portrait of His Holiness, Pope Benedict XVI. But can this really mean that in the modern world there are some who still believe the Pope to be equal to Christ and God?
Mr. President, final question.
Yes, sir.
You said famously, when you looked into Vladimir Putin's eyes, you saw his soul.
Yeah.
When you look into Benedict XVI's eyes, what do you see?
God.
Good way to end the interview.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. My pleasure. Sir.
In contrast, Dr. Ian Paisley is a Protestant minister with a long history of opposing Rome's influence in Great Britain. He has been a member of the British and European parliaments and retired in 2008 as the First Minister of Northern Ireland. Paisley considers himself a modern successor of the Reformers. What follows is typical of his preaching.
The darkest days in church history were always the brightest days for the Church of Jesus Christ. When they were burning, the saints of God, thank God the gospel burned with mighty fire. And thank God it was said in Scotland, when they burned Patrick Hamilton, the first martyr of the Scottish Reformation, that everybody his smoke blew upon became a Christian and left the old harlot, scarlet Church of Rome. We need to discover that in the darkest day, God has victory for his people. This is the victory that overcometh the world, even our faith. And thank God for the faith once for all delivered to the saints.
In 1988, when Pope John Paul II delivered a speech at the European Parliament, Paisley opposed him, shouting the words of Archbishop Cranmer, who had been burned at the stake. Like the Reformers of old, Paisley held up a sign and denounced the Pope as the Antichrist.
Permit me to say how much I